Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are looking at an article called Neither Incel Nor Volcel, Relational Accounts of UK Women's Sexual Abstinence. It's from 2023 and it's written by Karen Cuthbert. It's going to be discussed by Elizabeth Miller and me, Jo Brew. So welcome to this, and I think everybody knows you can put things in the chat if you want to, and we'll post this on YouTube later. So this article is about celibacy and abstinence in women, and it's an academic article published by Women's Studies International Forum last year, 2023. And it links up feminist writings about sexual abstinence from the past, first wave, but much from the second wave, and then looks at women's, it's focused on women's who are abstaining from sex or call themselves celibate in recent years. In the last, I think she did the research during or just before COVID, and it makes some really interesting points about how women use or decide to be celibate or abstain from heterosex, and how they view it. And the differences, the sort of depoliticization of that, and the lack of understanding today, or the different viewpoints. It's sort of, rather than seeing it as political, they are saying it's a personal strategy or a personal thing. And it's just such a brilliant piece of writing. One of the bits I liked massively, and is towards the end, she says, for them, the personal remains personal, which was a different way to the celibacy, different to the way celibacy had been practiced in the past. But there's loads of good writing in this, and it's very accessible. It's not one of these offensively difficult homo modern bits of yeah, so you can actually understand this. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, Elizabeth, for some more info on it.
Great, thank you, Jo. Can everyone hear me? I'm hearable. I found this article just sort of, I like to just sort of troll the internet looking for interesting feminist articles. And I found this one and I thought it was really interesting. As Jo said, it's by an academic at the University of Glasgow who's in the sociology department. Her name is Karen Cuthbert. And she said that the reason she wrote it was because there's been a lot of writing on the celibacy and abstinent practices of men, and why some men either are involuntarily celibate, called incels, or voluntarily celibate or abstinent. But they really there hasn't been much at all lately in the last decades about women choosing to be abstinent. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just a little thing about the sort of the abstract and why she decided to write the paper. Next slide. Right, so she talks about just the fact that she noticed that there really hadn't been discussion of women choosing to be abstinent, and why that was, and that this article is going to focus on women's abstinence, chosen abstinence. And she says it represents one of the only empirical examples which explores women's sexual abstinence, and it's the first paper to look at that at all in almost 30 years. Next slide. So as background, she says, she starts with historical background, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute, because I think it's really interesting. She says, I provide a context of how in early feminist thought, and she talks about the first wave and the second wave, women's sexual abstinence has been theorized and practiced as liberatory, which is frequently left out of feminist histories of sexuality. However, my findings highlight how for the women in this research, sexual abstinence was seen as a necessity born from surviving an aggressive and violent heteropatriarchal milieu. Next slide. And so she starts by talking about sort of old, ancient history going back to sort of the beginnings of recorded history. And these are things that I think we probably all know, but it's important to sort of ground the reasoning for her doing this research in this older history. That she talks about. She reviews that women's bodies have been controlled and women's sexual activity have been controlled and restricted by men, and that this is central to the organization of patriarchy, and that women's sexual purity has functioned as a commodity in the traffic and exchange of women, and also in ensuring the continuity of patriarchy, of the patrilineal line. When before we could test to see who people were connected to through their DNA, the only way to sort of quote unquote ensure that children were the children of a certain male was to prevent women from ever having sex with anyone but except the male that they had been married off to. And so along with that came a lot of things that we're all familiar with about sexual abstinence being demanded of women and girls, virginity being demanded of women and girls before they got married. And then once they were married, their sexuality was handed over to the one man that they were married to. And that there's been this sexual double standard throughout history where men could have sex with whoever they wanted, and that was actually sort of lauded. But for women, again, they were supposed to be controlled by the one man that they were married to. And if they weren't married, they weren't supposed to have sex at all. Next slide, please. So then she starts talking about first wave feminism and second wave feminism, and how after all of this history of abstinence as being something enforced on women, in first wave feminism, things changed and it became seen as a way of being independent, that women could choose celibacy for themselves. Well, some women could. So in the first wave, certainly like white middle class women who were kind of central to the first wave feminist movement, often would choose to remain single and choose to remain celibate, at least with regard to heterosexual sex with men, as a way of retaining their independence and their ability to participate in the public sphere. Because if they were married, first of all, since there was no birth control, they would probably start having children, which would certainly prevent them from being able to have much of a career or to be able to participate in the suffrage movement and other feminist movements. And so many of them actually chose to be single in order to have the opportunity to carry out political activism. Excuse me. And for a lot of them also, she points out that celibacy was also about making a political statement. So some of the famous women in the suffrage movement, like Christabel Pankhurst and Lucy Ree Bartlett, advocated for the adoption of celibacy and singlehood as a way of protesting what they called men's licentious and immoral sexual behavior and their abusive treatment of women. So it was seen as both a way to make themselves free to participate in the feminist movement, and also a political statement in and of itself. But the author points out that I thought this was really interesting. She says, to gain access to the rights enjoyed by white men, celibacy was employed as a strategy to move some women's bodies from the private to the public sphere, but without necessarily challenging that dichotomy and diluting its radical potential. Meaning that choosing celibacy was kind of a way out of the private sphere and into the public sphere for some feminists and suffragists, but it didn't actually challenge the underlying structure of society. It just kind of gave some women a doorway out.
Can I just step in there, because I found that found that one of the bad things about the article, that she did pander to this narrative that the first wave, or in fact all feminists, are basically white privileged racists. And I think that was a little bit of, oh, they were being really selfish trying to get into the private public sphere. But if you read about Christabel Pankhurst, I think there are a couple of other things that she chooses not to mention, which is, one, she had female partners, so it's a cover for lesbianism, which is much more radical and links up to other things. And then also, I don't think there's any evidence that that's what their motivation was, to get the rights enjoyed by white men. I don't know. I disagreed with her on that. I think yeah, I think certainly she says that, but I was annoyed when she said that.
Yeah, I was kind of annoyed too. And I think the point about their motivation is we can disagree with, but I did think that the sort of the outcome of it, I did think she made an interesting point about, which was that by refusing to marry and remaining single, it did give them the opportunity to participate in the public sphere, but that didn't undermine the patriarchal structure that was in place that sort of made most other women have to continue participating in that. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, but I suppose I'd still say it's not their fault. It's not Christabel Pankhurst's fault, because
No,
I think the motivation was to undermine the whole thing. They wanted
yeah,
to bring the whole thing down. And they were very, I mean, particularly like Christabel Pankhurst was very, very wanting to protect all women.
yeah.
That was so yeah. But anyway, it's true.
Yeah, I think it's,
It didn't affect the undermining.
yeah. I think it's really hard these days to write about first and even second wave feminism without kind of saying the magical incantation of, well, these were all middle class white women, and so therefore they're not as good as, you know, if they hadn't all been, which first of all, you know, isn't really, I mean, in the first wave, it was probably more true. Certainly in the second wave, that wasn't true. And so that does annoy me when people say, oh, well, it was just all middle class white women. Because A, it wasn't true, and B, I don't think that takes away from the importance of the movement. You know, they were still trying to work for all women. So anyway, that's kind of a whole nother topic that we could talk about at length, and we should. But for now, let's go on to the next slide. So then she talks about early second wave feminism and how abstinence was seen by many feminists there as emancipatory. Although she also talks about sort of what she sees as a division among feminists in the second wave. So she says some second wave feminists were very focused on kind of the, you know, the free love, free sex kind of view of women's sexuality, and seeing sort of the women's liberation movement as one of its main wonderful things was that it freed women's sexuality and let women sort of act like men and be as free as men to have sex. And then other second wave feminists disagreed with the notion that sex and sexuality were tools for liberation. So she mentions Valerie Solanas, who argued that sex was a distraction and a non-creative waste of time, which used up energy that might otherwise be spent mobilizing and organizing, which I thought was a really interesting point. Also, the author briefly mentions sort of the second wave reaction to Freudian psychoanalysis, which was very, very popular at the time, and made the case that there's nothing qualitatively distinct about sexual and erotic desire, but rather it is just life energy that can be fulfilled through other interesting, absorbing things. She also talks very briefly about political lesbianism and lesbian separatism, excuse me, such as that of the Furies in the US and the Leeds revolutionary feminists in the UK, that called for giving up sex with men rather than sex entirely, but deprioritized the importance of sex overall. And these groups saw lesbianism as a political commitment to devote one's energies to other women, rather than an expression of individual sexually embodied desire. Any thoughts on this before we go on, Jo?
Yeah, I think that a great thing about this article is that she is mentioning radical feminists like the Leeds Revolutionary Feminist, the 1981 article. She's got Valerie Solanas, who I suppose in many ways would be said to be radical feminist. And she's not, she mentions, if you look at the references, she's got Sheila Jeffreys, 1982, Free from All Invited Touch of Men, Women's Campaigns Around Sexuality, 1880 to 1914, which actually was published in this Women's Studies International Forum, this journal. And that, I think, is great because it makes it relevant to us. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's not pretending that the thinking that radical feminists have done isn't there. So she's, you know, in many ways, I suppose this is death to her academic career by mentioning that she's read this stuff, but it makes it very good for us because it actually knits together lots of good stuff and makes it, I mean, it's a fantastic article. Yeah.
Yeah, I was excited to see the citation to Sheila as well. And I agree. I mean, one of the reasons I chose this article was because I think it does create kind of a connection between this and some other books that I'm going to be talking about with Sheila in a few months, The Spinster and Her Enemies, and what's the other? Is it The Sexuality Debate? No, the Real Facts of Life, sorry, which is a collection of articles, including Sheila and other feminists. So next slide, please. So then the article talks about how after the early second wave, this idea of abstinence as emancipatory kind of drops off the feminist radar because feminism becomes increasingly pro-sex, which Sheila has talked a lot about in many of her books. But the author points out that there remained a few isolated texts in the 1990s and 2000s which take up the case for celibacy as being emancipatory for women. And she points to a piece of empirical research, which I now want to read because it sounds really interesting, by Sally Klein in 1994, where she interviewed women from the UK and the US, and many of her participants echoed this sentiment that we saw in the first and second wave, that being celibate was a way of resisting male domination and rejecting conventional forms and expectations of femininity. Where in society, even still in the 90s, being quote unquote properly feminine involved a willingness to cooperate in heterosexual activity. So I thought it was really interesting that women were saying that in this study in the 90s. And in the Sally Klein article and some other things that were around at that time, there was talk of celibacy being seen as a radical non-possession of others, as well as a non-exclusivity, which allows one to relate more fully to other people. And I found this interesting. I don't know how borne out this is, but it was an interesting idea that some scholars link this to being anti-capitalist, that celibacy acts as a revolutionary deprivatization of women through the dissolution of the family, and the family is a cornerstone of the capitalist mode of production. So I'm interested to see if there is any other scholarship from that time that talks about, that connects this to anti-capitalism. Any thoughts on that, Jo?
Unmute myself. Yeah, I think there's a lot in there, and what I find is, unlike a lot of the modern sexuality studies or this sort of queer theory, which is very, very biased towards this individualistic, we can break boundaries and be our true selves, she is thinking in this sort of much more in the tradition that we would be in, of thinking about sexuality as a means that patriarchy oppresses women, and also how capitalism, well, in this point you're making, capitalism is the sort of monetary method of oppressing women, but also exploiting the world and oppressing other other groups. Yeah, so I would say that, and you could see from the quotes that Elizabeth has got up that how good the writing is, and also how interesting. It's sort of new and dynamic. There's quite a lot of turns of phrase or paragraphs that I think this is so well put that it's really worth reading. Can I just ask, actually, is it available? You sent me a PDF of it. Is it available for people to download?
I think you might have to have some kind of like access to library, university libraries and stuff. But I mean, since I have it, I could maybe we could put the link into the video or send it around
Yeah,
somehow.
yeah.
Yeah, or if
Okay.
people just want to email me, I can also individually give it to people.
That's probably the best way of doing it, because it might be undermining of Women's Studies International Forum if we just start giving their stuff out for free. But I think emailing you. Can I put your email in the chat?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's do you have it?
I'll do it
Yeah,
in, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, great.
I noticed some people are in the chat are providing links. I'm not sure if they're links to this article or links to something. Oh, somebody just said it's open access on university website. Oh, so maybe on the University of Glasgow website where Cuthbert works. Yeah, maybe someone
Oh,
could check that.
oh,
Yeah,
brilliant. And I
Dorothea.
think Dorothy has put the link up. Perfect. Well, and I'll
Okay.
make sure it's in the YouTube video as well.
Oh, great. Okay. Could we have the next slide? Okay, so now we get into her research. So she did data collection to write this article, and her data collection was semi-structured interviews with both women and men who identified or recognized themselves in one or more of the following terms: asexuality, sexual abstinence, or celibacy. And she talks about, I won't go into it in great detail, but she talks about how she reached out to seek people to interview over the internet through various methods. And then she interviewed people. And she interviewed both women and men because she wanted to compare their experiences and their attitudes. And I'll talk a little bit about what she found out in a little while. So everyone was in the UK. They were all between 20 and 50 with an average age of 29. Participants varied in terms of ethnicity and class backgrounds, and most of them described themselves as heterosexual. Nearly all of them were single, although some of them said they desired to be in non-sexual but romantic relationships. Next slide. Okay, so now we start to look at what the women that she interviewed, and I'm going to focus more on what the women said, what they said about why they chose to be abstinent. So this was I thought, very interesting and very sort of sobering. She said all of the abstinent women in the study talked about how the main driver of their abstinence was the fact that having sex with men felt like it would be too much of a risk. The women described a feeling that having sex would be tantamount to a loss of self. Specifically, it was not that they felt sex itself was inherently unsafe, like unsafe for their physical safety, but they felt that the power disparities that they experienced in dating men and having sex with men, they felt that by having sex, they would be losing something of themselves. And then I have some names of individual people here who she interviewed. So Alora spoke of sexual relationships as a site where power was enacted between men and women. She said that men, in her experience, used sex as a way of controlling women, and that many of the women she knew were often left hurt and vulnerable after sexual relationships with men. And these are her quotes: "They become weaklings and broken." So I was very struck by that. That was such an extreme statement and so depressing. Then a woman named Donna, who's 32, says that it feels like you're giving in. I feel like I'd be giving away a big part of me, meaning if she were to have sex with men. And she says, by having sex with men, you're giving away your body and your personal freedom and your personal space. And then a woman named Oka, who's 50, said that she experienced that her male partners had acted in disingenuous ways to convince her to have sex, But then once she was conquered by them, was how she put it, then they became less interested in having a relationship. And so she said she didn't want to have sex anymore under those circumstances and opted out to protect herself. And again, I think all these women were talking about protecting themselves kind of psychically and mentally and psychologically, and in terms of their feelings of retaining their personal power. Next slide. Then they also talked about how they felt as a result of engaging in abstinence, and many of that, or pretty much all of them, said they felt like it gave them their power back and they regained control. So the abstinent women in the research felt that heterosexuality was a site of domination and a place where harm could come to women, and decided against having sex for that reason. And some of them also said that they articulated this abstinence as a way of regaining their independence or retaining their power. And so here's a quote that sort of sums up the common sentiment that I saw in a lot of the quotes from the interviewees. Now that I have my power back, now I have my power back, even if men still try to force me. I have my power back because I refuse to have sex. And Cuthbert points out that the accounts of abstinent women have direct parallels with early women's celibacy movements, as discussed in her review of literature, in which abstinence was practiced by some women as a way of carving out a space of independence and autonomy in a male-dominated society. Rather than abstinence being seen by them as them being controlled, they saw it as a way of fighting off extraneous control by men. Do you want to chime in,
Yeah.
Jo?
Yes, and I think what's great is we're getting lots of quotes from women in the last couple of years, having come to the explaining why they are refraining from having sex with men or choosing not to or whatever. And it's so close to the conceptions that we've had as radical feminists in the second wave and have been written, but you can see this pattern of it being much more individualistic. And the way she explains it unpicks that sort of helps us to bridge that gulf. And one of the bridge the difference between us who were in the second wave and have read that sort of stuff and young women today, or women today, who have no political or very little feminist political understanding. And one of the things I felt like as I was reading it is young women I know, quite a few of them, are saying exactly this. They're saying exactly what Cuthbert has come across. And they're saying they really are choosing or want to not have sex with men. And they might not articulate why, but a lot of them feel they're really, really trapped. And they see it in a personal way. And it makes it all the more clear that we actually have a political conception to it. And when I've given young women Andrea Dawkins' work, Andrea Dawkins' work answers a lot of the questions that women are coming up with around this, because she articulates the violence involved in those sexual relationships. And so I think it really helps us have an opportunity that we can try to engage with women who are living this realization, this becoming conscious of the horrors of sex with men, and not just have this personal thing, but politicize it. So I find it really, I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant piece. Back to you.
Yeah, when I got to this point in the article, I was thinking, well, they must all be doing this for feminist reasons. And, I was feeling pretty happy until I got to the next part of the article, which you kind of referred to and we'll look at in a second, which is that really none of them articulated feminist reasons for doing this. They didn't have any class consciousness, and it was done completely for personal individual reasons, feeling like, okay, this is really awful. I need to opt out of this system. So that depressed me. But then on the other hand, it points up the need for consciousness raising, and exactly like walking down the street handing out copies of Andrea Dworkin to young women, I think is a great idea, because I mean, I've been in a consciousness raising group myself, and it really shows you how going from women just articulating their individual experiences to taking a step to into the next step into class consciousness, it's not that hard of a bridge to golf, or a gap to golf, or whatever the phrase is, but somebody has to, I mean, I think women have to talk to each other, and then they start to see their commonalities, and then they start to see that there's a system in place. So that's, definitely, that really brought home the importance of consciousness raising to me. Next slide. So this slide talks about what she found in their responses, that there was no mention of feminism in any of their narratives, or any sense of a wider collective struggle. For the participants in this research, abstinence was more of an issue of forging a livable life for themselves rather than a feminist act. Their abstinence was, for them, as they described it to her, primarily a way of making out in the world as women. So they definitely didn't have the same kind of feminist consciousness that the participants in Klein's study in 1994 did. Their abstinence was very much individualized, ad hoc, and reactive to their own personal experiences with men. And they described it as something that they did to afford them a feeling of safety. And again, they really didn't talk, or at least she doesn't describe in the article, them talking about physical safety. Like, they didn't express that they felt physically threatened, but they talked about a feeling more of like psychic safety, mental safety, emotional safety. They felt not safe in those ways, and that was why they decided to opt out. And then she mentions a theory that someone named Saracen has coined called heteropessimism, which is a contemporary mode of feeling where heterosexuality is acknowledged as broken, but there's also a deep sense of apathy toward any possibility of change. And so it makes sense that would, if you don't see that there's a way to fix the broken system, it makes sense that you would perhaps choose to opt out as an individual. Next slide. Okay, so then she starts comparing in the article what men and women said to her, and you probably won't be surprised to hear that these things, that the way that men looked at abstinence and chose to be abstinent was for very different reasons, and with very different attitudes, and very different consequences, social consequences, than with women. So the abstinent women said, even though they had opted out and they felt that they got their power back and they were happy about it, they still, most of them were heterosexual and still wanted to find a male partner eventually. And they said that when they would let potential male partners know that they were abstinent for these reasons, they had a really, really hard time finding male partners who would accept that. Whereas men had exactly the opposite experience. So men who were interested in finding a partner said that when they talked about their sexual abstinence to women who might potentially be partners, the women thought that was wonderful. They were even more attracted to the men because they were abstinent, because the women endowed the men's choice of being abstinent with all sorts of positive qualities. Like, they felt that it made the men more responsible, more mature, more committed. So it gave the men greater stock in the dating scene. Whereas with women, they said that when they talked to men about their choice to be abstinent, it was seen that they were no longer offering the full package, to use. It's interesting that, she used this connection to a capitalist conception of that when women are dating, they have to offer men a package. And a big part of that package is sexual access. And so when the women made it clear that they weren't going to offer sexual access without commitment, that was looked upon very negatively by men. And so women's stock or capital went down by doing this, but men's stock or capital went up. Thoughts on that, Jo?
Yeah, and she talks quite a lot about the different experience and different relational position that men and women have. So incels are bitter about not being they're involuntary celibates, and they are bitter about it because they would like to have more sex. And she links that up to masculinity. So there's, I mean, it's only about 10 pages long, or even 9 pages long. There's lots in here.
She packs a lot in, yeah.
Yeah, and then how so masculinity would be wanting to have sex, and men are expected to want to have sex. So these men who are sort of saying that they don't want to have sex, to some extent, know that it's weird, and that they say sometimes, some of the men say there's social pressure by other men for them to say they want to have sex. So she's, but in this paper, she's really, really doubling down on this intricate bit of how sex is part of male or masculinity and femininity and expectations. She looks at it and what people are, how people are feeling right now. And then just finally about this bit you're so mentioning that for its stock for the abstinent men, because it makes them attractive. And then I think maybe you'll go on in the next slide to say it's a block for women. So women are, if they're not providing sex to men, then it's a block for them finding romantic relationships or relationships at all.
Yes,
That's it.
exactly.
Yeah.
I don't actually have any more slides, but yeah, that's exactly true about what she said in the article, that men choosing to be abstinent and telling women that they were choosing to be abstinent made their stock go up. And for women, it was a block instead of a stock. It was exactly the opposite, that it made them less valuable in the eyes of men. And I thought that was so telling, that this idea that women have to provide a package in the dating world, and that a big part of the package is sexual access, and that if women don't provide that, they are less valuable in the eyes of men in the dating world, whereas the men who were choosing to be abstinent actually became more valuable in the eyes of women, which kind of makes sense if we think of kind of the classic attitude of women going into looking for relationships and wanting commitment and dedication to the relationship, that women felt that men who were choosing to be abstinent would it showed that they were more dedicated and more committed. And I guess, to be fair to men, there were a bunch of quotes in the article where men said kind of those things, that they did want to have a closer relationship and a closer bond. I'll actually read one quote from a man who had chosen to be abstinent, where he says, so he actually, I guess, was in a relationship, but not being sexually active in the relationship. And he said it made the relationship stronger and more robust. And he says, when you're in a good relationship you've been in for ages and still not had sex, you get to know each other mentally, physically, spiritually, and all that. And then you have a stronger bond. And if you don't need to have sex, you can be in a happy relationship. So that was really interesting. And there were kind of some nice aspects to it, where some of these men did appear to be engaging in abstinence because they felt that it was a way to relate to women in a more genuine and human way, without sex getting in the way, kind of as a commodity.
And it links
I
up
was
also
surprised
to,
about that.
Yeah, but in The Spinster and Her Enemies by Sheila Jeffreys that we're going to cover, I think we've covered it before, but you're going to cover it with her again in a couple of weeks. She mentions in the 19th century there were a lot of marriages where they didn't have sex, so male-female marriages, and they only, if they wanted to have kids, they would have a very short period of having sex a bit in order to produce the kids, and then they just wouldn't have sex, and it was completely normalized. And it then towards the later bit of the 19th century and in the 20th century, there's been this massive amount of propaganda that sex is naturally, men want sex all the time and have to have it. And these men that we hear about in this article are showing it's not true, that some of them are choosing not to. And certainly for women, these women have sort of broken through the propaganda and mainstream media saying women want sex and it's all this sort of freedom, 1960s freedom. I mean, one thing it made me think about is in the 1980s, I started hating The Guardian, which, as people who don't know, in Britain, but it's a left-wing paper and it's progressive. And, you know, you would think as a sort of left-wing feminist, you would think, oh, great. But they had, on the women's section, or maybe the culture section, they had a couple of women sex therapists who every week would be promoting. I mean, the whole thing was promoting women's hypersexuality and the fact that we wanted to have sex with men. Um, but there were these therapists, and women would write in saying, I feel awful having, because my husband wants to have sex with me 5 times a week. It's horrific. And all these, the Guardian just on and on and on saying, you need to re-examine your views. You need to be re-educated. They didn't say diversity and inclusion, but that's basically it. And I think for quite a few of us who've been sort of radical for a long time, it's no surprise that what they're doing now about re-education of people. But I mean, they've been educating women to believe that we want to have sex, or telling us that we're weird if we don't want to have sex with men. Yeah. Can I read out a couple of things in the chat that are really helpful as
Yeah,
well? There's one thing.
absolutely.
Yeah, so there's something from Dorothea, and she says claiming an asexual identity removes any challenge to power in sexual relations. It personalizes the decision not to have sex and denies lesbianism as an option. And
Mhm.
then Caroline has said, I haven't put your surnames because I don't know if you want them to be put in here, but she said yes. But just to note, because this is after we mentioned, I think it was me mentioned Dawkins. Dawkins' Intercourse, her book, Andrea Dawkins' book Intercourse, really isn't about the horror and the violence. It's more of a good explanation of why these research respondents are understanding sex with men as a
Hmm.
loss of social standing. So I think
Hmm.
that's a good clarification point. Both of those two
Oh yeah.
comments were quite useful.
I would love to hear more about that actually. That that intercourse is a good explanation of why. I'm just looking at the comment that Andrea Dworkin's intercourse is a good explanation of why these research respondents are understanding sex with men as a loss of social standing. I would love to hear more about what Dworkin says in intercourse about that. Um, to respond to something that you were saying a few minutes ago, Joe, I love to read magazines. It's sort of restful to read things that are short. And I noticed that in not even what are necessarily considered like women's magazines, but just kind of mainstream magazines that are, you know, not necessarily focused on like news or science or something, but just like general magazines, they still talk in the same way about sex and marriage and how women are supposed to be ready for sex and marriage at all times, and that if you're not, you know, there's something wrong with you and you need to re-educate yourself. So it's exactly the same as it was 100 years ago. You know, Sheila in some of her books talks about the marriage manuals from like the 1920s through the 1960s and how women were supposed to, you know, provide sex for men and be interested in, not just provide it, but convince themselves to always be interested in it and always want it. And that exact same message is still in all the current magazines. And so you'll read an article about, like, if you're not interested in sex, here's all the ways to make it spicy and blah, blah, blah. And then on the next page, there will be ads for various drugs, things you can apply to yourself, to your body, in case your body isn't cooperating. And a lot of these are geared towards women after menopause, like, after menopause, are you dry and uncomfortable? Take this stuff and rub it on yourself. And so it's the exact same message in 2020. It's as it was in 1920, which I find really interesting.
I want to go back to a bit, one of the bits in when I was reading the article, talking about control. And that's an interesting thing that we haven't quite discussed, what she found out about control. She's saying that the men who want to be abstinent, so she also has talked to a few men in these, there are these sort of online groups of people, celibates or abstainers. Men see it as taking back control of themselves, of being in control. So what they're doing is the way they articulate it is they say, I have chosen to not follow my sexual desires and to do other things in my life, and I feel more in control. So I feel that I can, like fasting or something, or and she actually does link it up to those religious practices like Gandhi making out what a great man he was by supposedly not having sex with young women, even though he lay in bed with them. Like, so, but that sort of heightened being of a man is being in control of himself. And then what she says is that absolutely all the women said, I'm getting control of myself. I'm stopping somebody else having control over me. And they experienced sex with men as either actual physical bodily control, them taking control of the body, but a lot of the way that they talk about it is about the feeling that they have been controlled, and that they feel in control of their own bodies and their beings, their self. The women do. So it's the same sort of thing over and over again, that we are expected to relinquish control over ourselves. And they're really, it's a very moving reading this, because they're so clear about the horror of being controlled. And it's so difficult for them to make those decisions, but they're so gutsy about it, aren't they? They're sort of saying, well, look, I've just had enough, I'm not having it.
Yeah, I'm
which is
opting out
great.
of the system.
Yeah,
I also noted that when I was reading it, and how for women the control was outer directed and relationally directed, and for men it was completely inner directed, and it was all about like their own self-actualization. And I thought that was so telling, because it was so reflective of, for women it had to be relational, because they felt that they were experiencing a threat to their personhood, basically, by having sex with men, and control and domination, and they wanted to get out of that system, and that's what they were focused on. Whereas for men it was really sort of a method of like personal self-actualization, and it was all about what went on inside them. And I'll just read a quote from the article about that. So this is towards the end, where she's summing up her findings. She says, we also saw how control functioned in the narratives of both men and women participants in very different ways. For women, control was about keeping hold of a sense of bodily autonomy, where for the men whose bodily autonomy was never at risk, and I think that's the key thing, they never have to think about that. So there is no experience of men where they're thinking, if I have sex with women, women will have control over my bodily autonomy or my personhood, or they'll have dominance over me. That, there was 0% of any man in this study saying anything remotely like that. So it says, for the men whose bodily autonomy was never at risk, control was envisaged across the board as something that they skillfully deployed over their own sexual desire in a competent show of rationality and self-mastery. And then she goes on to say, for the women, abstinence as providing bodily autonomy was not politicized in any way. While they spoke of inequalities in gender relations, they did not conceptualize their struggle in any way as outside of their own personal experience.
Yeah.
So that, again, that circles back to, they didn't have any class consciousness or any thoughts of, this is a bad system for women. We should change this system. It was more like, this is bad for me. I want to opt out of it as an individual.
But in the chat, there's Maria's here and has saying she's noticed a huge change in women of her cohort, 30 and under. And welcome, because we very seldom have anybody under 30.
Yay,
We actually don't, we generally are talking to ourselves in terms of being a bit older. But this massive shift in understanding, and in the article, Cuthbert does talk about the Me Too movement, but also in Britain, and I think maybe it spread everywhere. We had this everyone's invited movement where young women under lockdown, once they had a bit of time to think, started communicating with each other and saying, well, I had a boyfriend and then he raped me or sexually assaulted me, or I was just walking through, hanging out with some friends, supposedly friends, and then they all massively insulted me, and you could see that they've been lying to me. Oh, but this, I think that was that has been a big change, and that brings consciousness, doesn't it? The Me Too movement and the everyone's invited, the consciousness, and it erupted, and hopefully it will. This consciousness can erupt, and if we can make links as radical feminists or revolutionary feminists or political lesbians or conscious feminists, we can help to politicize this and bring the personal to make it political, as Cuthbert's saying.
Yeah, I noticed that Maria in the chat, and I've heard of these Facebook groups, she points out that there are Facebook groups in every city called Are We Dating the Same Guy?
Oh, wow.
COVID lockdown, where women, and I've heard about these, where women like warn each other about specific guys behaving badly. And I've also heard that men are getting really enraged about these groups and trying to have them shut down, which I'm not surprised by that. I bet nobody's surprised by that. But yeah, but it's good to hear that there are places online and hopefully also in person where women are gathering to share these experiences, so that they're not just having these experiences individually, siloed off from each other.
I've often thought, and then thought, no, I shouldn't do this. What I'd like to do is set up an online, like hotel comparison site, which just had a boyfriend comparison site, and then any male that any female went out with would be able to say, well, I went out with him and he said X, Y, Z. He didn't use porn, whatever.
0 out of 5 stars.
Then he did.
Yeah.
Yes, 0 out of 5. And then when you think it through, you think, oh, that'd be really fun. That'd be really, really useful. But it would end in violence. It would end in male violence, because the men would be so angry and women would be too scared to write down what actually happened in their relationships, I imagine. But these Facebook groups sound fantastic. I think I'm going to join them just to see what's, hopefully, if I can, see what's going on. I want to add something else I got from this. In the abstract, which is the beginning of the academic article always, it says, understanding gender as inherently relational, I juxtapose women's accounts of men with those of the men. But this idea, gender, so the sex role stereotypes, are not just things that you can identify with or as an individual, but it's in relation, it's inherently relational. And I would just recommend everybody read this article, because there are so many really good phrases in there that help you understand, you know, just to be able to say gender is inherently relational is so helpful, and it builds understanding that it is a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of this sort of tension that we always hear where like the trans movement tries to say gender is this thing with reality that is inherent to people and people can identify in and out of it, whereas feminists point out that what gender is a hierarchical system of dominance and, you know, superiority and inferiority. Very much, you know, it's relational in the sense that it's a power imbalance and a power dominance hierarchy. That's what gender
Yeah.
is.
And it links up to, I mean, one a friend of mine who was a lesbian has transitioned. I haven't seen her, but apparently she has. And apparently she just hangs out with all the lesbians. She doesn't, her wanting to be a man and wanting to have that gender wouldn't work if she was hanging out with loads of men, because she she isn't a man, and they know that. And I think it sort of, she could identify as more masculine within a women's community, but when she actually, so it's relational, and she just wanted to rubber stamp it, I feel quite masculine, and then in my opinion a massive mistake, actually says she's a man. She could just be a woman who's got what people think as stereotypically masculine things.
Right. Yeah, well, that's actually, I, in my experience, that's really pretty common for women who transition, you know, so-called trans men, is that they still want to hang out with women, but they want to be seen as men. I mean, somebody should really do a study of that, because I think that's the combination of those two attitudes is really interesting to me. Because at some level, first of all, they know they aren't men. And secondly, well, I guess this is sort of the hopeful part, even though they transition to being men, they then don't want to go and hang out in men's world and become, you know, toxic, etc. So that's kind of, you know, the hopeful part is that they
Yeah.
still relationally kind of relate more to women's community.
Yeah,
But it's
I mean, I
strange
I
tension.
was I was educated at an all-girls school, and I mean, in the 70s, and I remember feeling very much like, if I sort of felt like I was more of a boy. Of all the girls in my year, I was one of the boys. Like, not, I didn't think about it much, but I just thought I'm a bit more of that sort of person. And then for sixth form, I went to what was mostly a boys' school, and um, I very much immediately thought I was a female. It was so relational.
Yeah.
It wasn't inherent in me. It was to do with who was around, and that sort of subjugation, that dominance. The boys made it very, very clear. You
Yeah.
are a female and we're going to dominate you.
Well, I think that really points up how important the project is of getting rid of gender roles, gender stereotypes, because everybody should just be able to, you know, be interested in what they're interested in, wear what they want to wear, and not have it be something where that puts you into a certain box. Okay, if you like this, or you relate to the world in this way, or you're a loudmouth or whatever, that means you are no longer in the girl box. You are not, you must be in the boy box. I mean, that's what we need to get rid of.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we've come to the end. It's been fantastic, interesting discussion. As always, lots of the richness comes from the chat.
Yeah, the
Um,
chat is great.
it's just great being part of this group. We've had over 90 of us here. Seems to me that the numbers always increase near the end of the webinar, because everybody's really just coming along to this in order to
Everyone
go to
wakes
the
up.
breakout rooms.
Yeah.
Which are really good. So that is a good idea. But we've put in the chat, this is on YouTube later, so you can watch it, the rest of it. And next week we've got Tonja Givjon from Norway talking about a book she edited, which would be really amazing. And
Oh, yeah.
Elizabeth, you're back in a couple of weeks as well, aren't you, doing the Sheila Jeffries book with Sheila?
Right. Sheila and I are going to be talking about The Spinster and Her Enemies in April. I think it's in April. No, I guess it's in May now.
Yeah,
And then we're
something.
also going to be talking about The Real Facts of Life, which is a book probably a lot of people probably aren't familiar with, which is a collection of articles by Sheila and various other people that is kind of related to a lot of the same topics in A Spinster and Her Enemies. So I love that book. It's really interesting. And that's going to be, I think, at the end of May.
As always, it's just amazing. Like, we've been doing this for, I don't know, 2.5 years or quite a long time, and we just it's incredible. Every week we come to more interesting books or articles and incredibly useful insights. So
It's a
thanks
whole
everybody
online
for being here.
university at this point.
Yeah, and we'll start giving out degrees, giving out homework.
Yeah, homework, definitely.
Write an essay. Okay. See you everybody. Maybe see you in the breakout room. See you next week, and thanks for coming. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Joe. Thank you,
Bye
everyone.
bye.